Your first presenter today in this session is Patrick O'Shell in political science, who will be presenting his thesis, A New Equilibrium, Neoliberalism, the Administrative State, and Antitrust in the 21st Century. And his advisor is Dr. Shirk, who is with us in the back today.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk on neoliberalism, the administrative state, and antitrust. So about a year into the Trump administration, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue implemented a new regulatory policy. This new regulatory policy allowed plants to run their lines as fast as they'd like, cut USDA on-site enforcement by 40%, and put plants in charge of processing and inspecting their own meats. Within 2 years, plants that were operating under this new regulatory framework had twice the digestive and fecal matter on their pork. One question you may be asking yourself is, when is the last time I ate pork? Because that is disgusting. But a second question you should be asking yourself is, how did we allow this to happen? How did we get to a point where a government agency that we expect to protect us actively undermines its own ability to do so? But differently, what's changed in recent political history to allow something like this to happen? This is the question my paper starts with. Put into a historical context, this pork regulation fits in about a 40 to 50 year pattern of political attacks against the administrative state. These attacks have been informed by neoliberal ideology, and thus my paper tries to establish three things. One, that these attacks were and are definitively neoliberal. Two, that these attacks have undermined the ability of the administrative state to function on our behalf. And three, that the relationship between neoliberalism and the administrative state has special implications for antitrust enforcement. So first I'm going to try to define some of my terms here. Neoliberalism is first and foremost a political ideology. As a political ideology, it has its own assumptions about the relationship between state, society, and markets. Thus, to attribute an action as neoliberal, it has to meet two different conditions. One is that the action has to be done with assumptions that are similar to the writings of neoliberal philosophers and economists. And two, that those actions have to be done with the intent to establish conditions that a neoliberal would find favorable. But for the purposes of this presentation, you can just understand neoliberalism as a general opposition to government activity in society. And this is done on three premises. One is the preeminence of individual rights above anything else. The second is the self-correcting nature of markets. And third is the aggregate benefit that society receives from everyone pursuing their individual self-interest. The administrative state is a bit easier term to define. These are just federal agencies that are labeled as executive, regulatory, and independent. That just means different levels of government oversight on these agencies. One takeaway that I want you guys to walk away from this presentation with is the necessity of the administrative state. This body of government is an absolute necessity because without it, there's no way to control for negative market externalities. These are costs that are shifted onto society by those that are participating in the market onto people that are not participating in this market. The second reason it's a necessity is the distribution of public goods and services. These are goods and services that cannot be efficiently distributed by a private market. A good example of this is Social Security Administration or the Post Office. A good example of of negative externalities is the EPA, right? A classic example of negative market externalities is pollution, and the EPA is designed to mitigate that. And the third reason the administrative state is a necessity is setting regulations and standards. Of course, some markets can self-regulate, but sometimes we determine the costs of that self-regulation to be too high. A good example is the pork regulation, right? Yes, that market could theoretically self-regulate, but the cost of doing so would be E. coli infection. And as a society, we determined that that is a cost not worth bearing. Moving on to real material neoliberal attacks on the administrative state. I'm just going to describe the judiciary attacks today. There have been significant attacks through other branches of government and through the executive and Congress. But I think the scariest ones really are the ones in the judiciary. So the administrative state lies on two legal principles. That is the exemption of the non-delegation doctrine and judicial deference. These sound complicated, but I promise they're very simple. I'm going to try to break them down really quick. Non-delegation doctrine is basically a constitutional principle that says Congress can't delegate its rulemaking authority to another organization or body of government. So the exemption of that principle allows Congress to then enshrine a body with the ability to create laws. A good example of this is, say, the Clean Air and Water Act. Congress says we want clean air and water, but Congress doesn't have the means to know exactly what that entails. So you create an administration like the EPA that then can carry that out and enshrine that administration with the ability to create laws to fulfill clean air and water. Judicial deference is another legal principle that basically means when a executive agency or federal agency once you create a rule, when that rule is then challenged in court, a judge defers to agency experts on that rule because they don't have an ulterior motive, say like a profit. However, both of these legal principles have been undermined since the 1980s. Starting with the non-delegation doctrine, Justice Scalia, starting in the mid-80s to early 90s, wrote extensively about how the non-delegation doctrine should be reinstituted, which should terrify everybody because at worst, this can label the entire administrative state as illegal. At best, it can greatly inhibit the administrative state's ability to function, basically limiting any rulemaking powers they have. Judicial deference has equally been attacked since 1980 to the point where it's almost non-existent. Judicial deference was officially established in Chevron versus NRDC in 1980. But since then, it's been undermined through various court cases, most notably Michigan versus EPA, where the rulemaking ability of agencies was undermined. These attacks are inherently neoliberal because they reflect certain assumptions that are prevalent in neoliberal writing. One is that the administrative state is a fourth branch of government that has unchecked power, and that because it is an unchecked power, it'll inevitably trample rights and freedoms of everyone in society. Of course, it's going to be further from the truth. The US model, the administrative state is already inherently very constrained, but nonetheless, that is a fundamental belief that underpins those actions in the judiciary. The second way that this reflects neoliberal concerns is the preeminence of individual rights and aggregate benefits. By getting rid of these agencies, you create more economic growth and deregulate these industries. All this put together should really terrify people, especially because we currently have 3 to 4 Supreme Court justices that adhere to both of these principles, that there should be no judicial deference and that we need to reinstitute the non-delegation doctrine. Moving on to how this affects antitrust specifically. Well, first, I'll describe what antitrust is. Antitrust is a set of laws that are designed to promote market competition. This came in the early 1900s, and along with these laws was the establishment of the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, which, similar to the EPA, is put in charge of carrying out these antitrust laws. But the FTC and the administratives and other antitrust enforcement agencies, such as the Antitrust Division and the DOJ, have been subject to the same trend as the overall trend of the administrative state. This means their scope has been greatly limited in the last 40 to 50 years. And there's significant evidence for this historical constraint, looking at the writings of Robert Bork, who pretty much gutted any antitrust enforcement capabilities from a neoliberal lens. And similarly, that third bullet point, I think, is actually incredibly important to bring it to relevant today. That's the same way that Reagan talked about the administrative state in the 1980s. To be fair, he was talking about executive agencies which are under the oversight of the executive branch, but there's an increasing politicization of independent agencies which are supposed to be designed to be outside of executive oversight. However, in the last Trump administration, we saw that that branch of government is becoming increasingly scrutinized as well. Evidence is Trump's treatment of Fed Chair Jerome Powell. But the most significant way that neoliberalism has hampered antitrust enforcement, there's 3 there, but I'm just going to talk about the market definition debates. That neoliberal thought has so greatly limited the definition of a market in antitrust enforcement to the point where you can just look at a market and define it so narrowly that you never see any concentration in it. But moving on from that, I'd like to open the floor to Q&A because I'd like to talk to you guys about this more.
What can we do about this?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So I think one thing we can do about the antitrust issues specifically is repoliticize those. Antitrust was actually a key issue in a couple presidential debates in the early 1900s. I think repoliticizing those laws could actually really help their enforcement capabilities. Because I didn't talk about it in the presentation that much, but public support for this stuff is incredibly important, because if there isn't as much public support, then those that are the most invested in destroying it are going to be the ones that are most engaged. Thank you for asking the question. Yes?
Is this a global trend that you see, or can you compare it with another country where there's a contrasting experience?
That's a good question. I can't say for sure, but from what I read, Europe has a more insulated administrative state, so to speak, that isn't as subject to the whims of elected politicians. I don't know if that's really worked that much better. I can't say that for sure, but I know there are different models out there. Yes. Oh, yes. Black shirt.
When is the last time you ate pork?
The last time I ate pork was last time my mom was in town, because she made pork lumpia and I couldn't stop myself from eating it. Yes,
So
Dr. Sherk.
you mentioned big tech in your presentation and talked about the role of big tech. Much of the story that you tell is a story about how ideology has changed practice in government and has reduced or cut the legs out from under governmental regulation. What's the role of technology? I'm thinking particularly of the communications sector, where we went from a period in the post-war era when communications technologies were regulated by the government because the government literally owned the airwaves and licensed the airwaves to communications companies. But with the advent of cable, we saw the privatization of information transmission. And with the rise of the internet, sort of the further distancing of companies from government regulation, because the government doesn't, even though Al Gore invented it, doesn't control the internet. So, I mean, the story you tell is one of, like, the idea of neoliberalism sort of caused this phenomenon. But there's also, I would argue, a technological side of this story that has made it more difficult for the state to regulate private enterprise by its nature. There's also separately, and this is part of neoliberalism, a financial story where the financialization of our economy, the growth of large capital firms, has also made it difficult for the state to regulate because they're frankly more powerful, more economically, they have more economic power than the state itself. But I'm mainly focused on the technology side. I mean, even if we wanted to rein in companies with regulation, could the state do it since they don't own the airwaves that many of these companies?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. One, first I say we haven't even tried to regulate them, so we can't really say for sure we can. But yeah, I would say technology, especially communication technology, has definitely facilitated the spread of especially neoliberal ideology, and has of course influenced the ability of people to get engaged with the process. And unfortunately, in the last 40, 50 years, the wrong people have been getting engaged in that process. Yeah. Yes.
To follow up on the second half of Dr. Shirk's question, with corporations and capital having like seemingly more power than the state now, how can the government take back any of that power, and what's the hope for getting regulations passed if corporations are more powerful?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because one of the fears of regulating is that they can just pick up shop and leave. I think that was probably, especially going back to Dr. Shirk's point about technology, is that starting in the 60s and 70s when these regulations did, I will say too, they did go overboard at a certain point, and that government regulation did go overboard a little bit. But yeah, back to your question, I do think it would be incredibly difficult for a sovereign state to rein in these economic powers, especially with their global reach, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, because there are clear costs to not doing so. Yes?
I was just wondering if you've given any thought to like the political rhetoric of slashing regulations and all this has been pretty common lately. And you were saying there's a need to like politicize the issue of protecting the administrative state. And so I was just curious about like rhetorical strategies in order to do so. Like you mentioned, like we would all have E. coli, but like have you thought about how politicians can better like communicate how important the administrative state is to us as citizens?
Yeah, well, one, I don't think we're going to get help from politicians on this per se. I think it matters who we get into office. But that being said, repoliticizing these issues, so like USDA is a perfect example with that pork regulation, that these agencies, USDA, EPA, can't think of any other, FTC, all of these came in on the backs of real solid social movements in the early 1900s. These were the products of hard-fought victories from labor and other social organizing. So I have to say, if we want to do our part in repoliticizing it in a positive way, one thing we should do is definitely get organized in communities that are affected by these to, challenge in the public space. Any other questions?
All right, thank you. Thank you, Patrick.